Welcome to the Leafy podcast, helping real estate investors and entrepreneurs grow. Say hello to your hosts, Jennifer Gligoric and Brian Price, founders of Leafy Legal Services, teaching you how to protect your assets, grow your business, and manage your wealth. Let's start the show.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Leafy Podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm your podcast manager, Tammy Geerling, and joining me today are our hosts, CEO and COO of Leafy Legal Services, Brian Price and Jennifer Gligoric. Thank you both for being here today. I know we have an awesome guest that we're about to introduce, so I will go ahead and pass it over to them.
Yes, and this guest lives not far from me because he's a native Texan and a Galvestonian, and we actually got to meet for coffee. So, I'm very happy to actually have him on board. He's such a wealth of knowledge. I'm going to kind of run through his stuff. So, he does international trade law. So how this relates to what we do is he works with foreign investors, but he's also a wealth of knowledge in offshore trusts. He's a licensed attorney here in the state of Texas. So let us welcome Rocky Reidel. Rocky, I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
Tell us all about it. So so if I'm a real estate investor and or an entrepreneur, because we have both that are in our listening audience, when should I consider thinking about having an offshore trust?
Good question. Good question. So when you get to that point, primarily you're either going to be already considering something offshore, whether it's a condo that you want to live in or some type of rental property. If you're considering that, if you already have offshore assets, a trust would be a great thing to look at and consider. A lot of times these days, I will say that folks are primarily looking at it from I don't want to say an exit strategy from the U.S., but more of a perspective of, we're close to retirement, we have significant assets, but we don't trust maybe the tax system in the U.S. or we have, potential legal liabilities that we want to extricate ourselves from and move into a safer jurisdiction that makes it a little more difficult for folks to reach out and grab us. So a lot of times that's what I'll see is folks that are business owners or retiring, selling that, want to move overseas to live or buy a vacation home. And occasionally, at times the international trust works for them, depending on what their ultimate goals are. And that's a big part of our process. If I can just jump to that real quick, I don't want to go too deep, but about our process, that's one of the first things that we'll do is sit down with the potential client. We'll discuss their goals, and that's going to be a very in-depth discussion. And that you can't have all your eggs right in one basket, in a sense. So if you want to maintain control of your assets, but you want to minimize your taxes, and you also want to pass it on to the next generation, chances are you're probably not going to be able to do all three. So you're going to have to choose what goals are most important to you and re-rank those with them. Sometimes it's passing wealth on to their great-grandchildren or whatnot, which in the U.S. you'd hit the generation skipping tax, things like that. So goals are important. We talk about that. So passing wealth on to other generations, minimizing taxes, minimizing liability, so making it harder for creditors or future creditors to reach out. We'll go in depth with a lot of those, and that's the important first step with anyone who's interested in estate planning and estate planning overseas, in particular national trusts.
Mm-hmm. And how much money should you have? I think we talked about it, and you said around $250,000 liquid cash. Is when it makes sense.
Yeah, generally yes. That could be a little lower if you already own assets overseas, like real estate or something else. But generally, you're going to need to have quite a bit of wealth. Now, in that depending on liquidity, it could come from a home. If you're going to sell a home and you can turn that into cash that you want to invest overseas or put into some type of a vehicle. I wouldn't say it's a strict rule, but the more liquidity that you have, the greater wealth you have, the more it's going to make sense to try something overseas and put it into a trust. And the reason for that is that the startup costs and the ongoing compliance costs are going to be generally higher than what you're used to, like putting it into an LLC or something. And that's just because of the expertise involved with making sure that they're structured correctly, and then the ongoing tax compliance.
Oh, okay. So would you say it has to be a lump sum? Because some people like to put in a little at a time. Is that something that you would discourage, or just want someone that would put like $200,000 into it all at once?
That's good question. That I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, I would discourage that, but you would want to make sure that your ongoing costs are going to make sense for what you're putting into it. So, if they have a lesser amount, maybe 100,000 or maybe even like 80, 90,000, potentially they can set something up, but that would be an important consideration in the goals that we would go over, that keeping your compliance costs as low as possible while you're funding that is going to be, is going to make a lot of it's going to make your decision a lot easier, because you're going to have to choose from a smaller package essentially, or a smaller number of options available to you. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'd necessarily discourage it, but that would be a very, very careful stage it would have to plan.
Okay. So just so everybody understands, what do you mean by compliance costs? What does that mean?
Sure. Okay. So compliance costs, your tax filing. So any type of an offshore asset these days has to be reported to the IRS. So as U.S. persons, which is a U.S. citizen, a national, or a green card holder, so a U.S. resident, you are considered a U.S. person, and you have to report all of your assets and income to the IRS, and generally you have to pay taxes on it, very generally. So your compliance cost is making sure that you file those reports correctly. That can vary. There are several different forms you may have to file for different types of assets. And so a trust is a term that is used kind of as an umbrella. There's lots of different ways they can be set up in lots of different available, but the IRS will define it as an entity where the responsibility for the protection of assets is vested in a trustee for the benefit of a beneficiary, where the beneficiary does not have control. So that boiled down basically means you have three parties. You have a settlor or a grantor who provides the assets to the trust. You have the trustee, who's the manager, and you have a beneficiary who benefits from that trust. Very, very generally, a rule of thumb is that you can't be all three. Sometimes you can be two of the three, but you cannot be all three. You can't own the assets, you can't manage the assets, you can't benefit from it. And the IRS will look at the type of trust that you have formed or the type of financial vehicle that you have, and they will run through a couple tests. And one of those tests would be, of course, that to figure out whether it is a trust or whether it's a business operation that's called a trust, how it should be taxed, and what type of compliance is necessary. So paying for that expertise to figuring that out beforehand, and having your CPA or your accountant to make sure you report that correctly and provide those documentation is the ongoing cost.
So go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I was just going to ask is what kind of pitfalls do you think that we should look for when looking at doing a foreign trust, to make sure the people that are setting it up are doing the right thing? It sounds like it's, there's certain laws you really need to follow, and it sounds like you get in big trouble if you don't do it right.
So, good point there. So the folks who are going to be your trustee, it's going to be very, very important to know them, to have hopefully an existing relationship somehow, either through an attorney or a banker, so that they can be trusted. You will, a lot of times it makes sense if you're going to be putting a large sum of money or assets to go visit that trustee, to go visit that jurisdiction and learn more about it. So that's one aspect of it, is knowing the trustee, figuring that jurisdiction out and knowing it. The next step, of course, is having good attorneys, both here locally in the U.S. and also overseas in that jurisdiction that's going to be putting those documents together and managing it for you. Within that, there are organizations, and I remember some acronyms, but I don't want to say it because I don't remember the name. I don't remember what they stand for. But there are some organizations that help professionalize international trusts across the globe. And, going through those organizations, looking at whether your trustee and your attorney have the certifications or have membership in those professional organizations, I think would add some credibility to what they do and behind them. And then, of course, looking at just the typical things like how long they've been doing it, who some of their other clients are, which may not be so easy to find, but sometimes they're willing to have some sample clients that they disclose.
Okay.
So since you can't be all three in a foreign trust, so let's say
or in any trust too,
or
even
yeah.
domestic. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, yeah. But you can't be all three. But let's say someone says, well, I'm worried about, my retirement. I want to retire overseas. My spouse and I have already talked about it. We want to go to Belize or Cook Islands or wherever. Is there any way that you can rest assured of getting a good grantor or a good manager when you are the beneficiary of the trust, but you don't have control of it, but yet you're the beneficiary of it?
Sure. So, of course, going over the due diligence, like we just discussed, and knowing who that trustee is, knowing the background and professionalism. Sometimes there are mechanisms that if you are living overseas, which actually would make it a little simpler for U.S. tax reasons, but if you do move yourself overseas and want to put it into a trust, sometimes overseas trust jurisdictions will have not exactly loopholes, but they will have certain structures where you can have an LLC that is owned by the trust that you manage. So you're the manager of the LLC. You control the direction of the LLC at the behest of the trustee and the trust who owns the LLC. And then that LLC will own assets within your jurisdiction, within that island or wherever you're at, and manage it. So you still have direction and control over those assets. Now your trust will actually have ownership interest in it, but they won't, and they will direct it through you. So you will have excuse me, you'll be in the chain of command essentially in directing that LLC. But that generally is not usable if you are a U.S. resident, because you'll have U.S. tax obligations to it, or domiciled in the U.S., so living still in the United States. If you're overseas, you can probably qualify for some of the foreign income credits. That will make that a little easier, because generally, if that's the case, the IRS would not consider it a true trust, and it would either be a foreign passive income corporation or some other type of a business entity. But so there are some options available like that. That's just a sample. Some jurisdictions make that a little easier, some don't. But in general, if you are domiciled, you're still living in the U.S. and you put those in an overseas trust, you're not going to have as much control over it, because you'll trigger greater tax obligations if you're all three.
Right. This reminds me, somebody was talking about, there was an issue with the Cook Islands with, so a guy was married, and he and his widow moved there, and he was trying to get away from paying the IRS, right? And he ended up passing.
Not recommended. But.
Right. He ended up passing, and they seized whatever assets. But she had a pretty good trust there in the Cook Islands, and the IRS was coming after her, and they lost twice. And I don't know what ended up happening a third time. And what happened is she was so upset. At that point, she was like, "Just give them." She had enough at that point to pay them off.
Yeah.
Just pay them. And the Cook Islands said no. Her trustor said no. We're not going to be doing that.
Yeah. So the Cook Islands is, I would say they're rather typical trust jurisdiction, but I think they are a little tougher protection than some places, even like in the Caribbean. And what probably happened there was that the settlor who put the assets in and created the trust documents created certain rules for how that trust situs or the assets are distributed, and said either it can't be distributed for taxes or can't be sent to the U.S. or whatever. So something that prevented that from happening. And in the Cook Islands, if I recall correctly, I'll preface that because I haven't looked at Cook Islands in a while, but what I think happens is that in the Cook Islands you have to put a bond up before you're allowed to start a lawsuit against that type of vehicle, a trust or some type of other financial instrument there. And once you put that bond up, then there's still other requirements that may require you to get a judgment from another jurisdiction, so from the United States. And then there's a third wheel in that little machine that's always spinning, is that there are time limits from when you secure that judgment to when you can start the process in the Cook Islands and when you have your bond for when you can sue. So a lot of times, from what I recall, is that usually one of those wheels will fall off, right, in the process. Like, oops, we didn't get our bond, or oops, we missed a timeline from when we get the judgment in the U.S. and when we can file in the Cook Islands. And that will preclude any type of Cook Islands courtroom filing a judgment and issuing a judgment against that trust to pay whomever, whatever creditor it is. So likely that's just the few facts I have. I think something like that probably happened. And that's one of the benefits of international trust. There are some downsides, of course, but definitely one of the benefits is that a lot of these jurisdictions will take privacy and protection of the assets very seriously. And for non-U.S. foreigners who do that, it's awesome. They a lot of times they can escape their own tax obligations. In the U.S., that it's not so easy. Our government claims jurisdiction over the entire world, basically, wherever you are at. But even though they claim that, jurisdictions like the Cook Islands, I want to say, I think the Seychelles was similar, but I feel like they may have changed recently. Jurisdictions like those they don't care. They're like, look, U.S., you're big, you're powerful, you want the money, but frankly, we feel like our laws and we value protection of these assets and the privacy of our trustee holders and beneficiaries more important than having a tax treaty with the U.S. or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. That's one of the interesting aspects of global assets and wealth and asset protection at an international stage is a lot of these countries, some of them will just willingly work with the U.S. and others will say, no, let's slow it down because we have greater values than just a U.S. partnership.
And so would you suggest, because I know most people would be like, well, if we're pals, it's probably they're going to be more U.S. friendly. They'll be more citizen friendly if I retire there, blah, blah, blah. But for an asset protection standpoint, that may not be really the case, correct?
Yes. Depending on the jurisdiction and where they're at, what their laws state, they could be in a situation where they will be more willing to work with the U.S. and others are not. Now, there are other aspects of cooperating with the U.S. I will say that almost the entire globe has already accepted, and one of those is FACTA, FAA, was it? I think TCA. And basically, I don't remember what that acronym stands for either, some law, but whatever they decide it stands for. But essentially, that requires most of the world and most of the world's banks as well to send reports and reporting requirements on U.S. citizens or U.S. residents, U.S. persons, basically, for any assets that are held within that country or within that bank. So hiding stuff is basically impossible these days legally. It's something you got to deal with, and unfortunately that is an aspect of estate planning that we have to take into account. But the IRS and the government is going to know where it is and what is there. The other side of that coin, of course, is it's up to the trust in that jurisdiction and the way you structure your trust to make it more difficult for the IRS and the United States government to have access to it. So knowing where it is different than having access, and that's I just wanted to make that distinction because a lot of states.
A lot of people think about these things, right? So and they come to us. They come to us for asset protection here in the States, especially real estate investors. And you can't really hide anything. They're going to know we're a digital age. We can pull anything up. What you can do is protect yourself by putting layers in place to protect yourself, so that if you're going to criminal and being criminal and the whole power of the U.S. government's behind it, well, they're going to break open all these little safety barriers because you've been bad, right?
Yes.
But even so, it takes a long time. So like when people think about, why didn't they just go get Epstein? They knew where he was. Everyone knew what he was doing. This is about, they still, even in a case like that, an egregious case, a horrific man doing horrific things, there was still a process to have to go through that they would have to break open. And it took a decade, a very, very, very long time. So when you talk about asset protection for regular people, if you're like a regular person and you don't have, the CIA, FBI, and whatever's all over you, then you can rest assured you can feel safe at night. Nothing can protect 100%, but just don't go and be an
it's like an
Epstein.
onion. The more layers you have to get to the center. Yeah, exactly. And that's an interesting point that I would like to make about international trust. So how the IRS will determine what's a domestic and a foreign trust. It's not just based on where the trust is. So there's actually two tests. There is it's court and control test. So the first is the court test, and that means that if a U.S. court has jurisdiction over a foreign trust, wherever it's domiciled, then that would be a domestic trust. It would be considered domestic according to the U.S. government and the IRS. So things like anything in like Puerto Rico or Guam, U.S. courts can reach out and grab those. So that is a U.S. trust. The other aspect of it is control. If anyone who controls the trust, so any trustees who are U.S. persons or have domicile in the U.S., that will make that trust a domestic trust. And that's one of the important aspects of choosing your trustee right, because there have been instances where the trustee is a global company or corporation or whatever that then expands into the U.S. or something, and that definitely has implications for international trusts that they have in certain jurisdictions, and depending on how it's set up. But
so they can have less onion layers than they thought they did when they first signed up.
Yeah, exactly.
And are they required to notify you? So let's say you set up with a bigger company or whatever, or are you required to get notifications when that changes? And do they have any responsibility to help you move that out?
Not by statute, not by a law, typically, but you could write that into your trust documentation, certain types of reports and such. But that's why it's important to have that type of rapport with your trustee. And understanding their jurisdiction. But I will say that this is something that a lot of foreign trust companies and trustees will be aware of. It's probably, when I have seen instances like that, it's nothing recently, but it probably was whenever these tests were being developed by the IRS and the U.S. court system, where some folks kind of said, oops, we didn't know it yet. So that happened. And that control, I will say also that the control aspect of these tests, if your trustees fly into Houston or they fly into New York City to manage the trust with you or manage a trust on your behalf and meet with you, potentially there are instances where the IRS and some courts have said that meets the control test. So even if they are in the U.S., and they're not U.S. persons, but they come here temporarily to manage your trust for you, then that could trigger the trust being considered domestic. And the reasoning behind that is that if they're here in the U.S. physically doing something, then potentially the U.S. would have jurisdiction over them, right? They're here physically. We can grab them and say, do this before they leave.
So it's best if you go over there. You'd have to.
Yes, yeah, or if they're already domiciled overseas, wherever the jurisdiction is, to just work with them remotely and have them stay there. You could go overseas to work with them, but as long as they don't come here as your trustee, that would be fine.
Man, there's a lot of rules for that. So people, I know people when they think about, an offshore trust and offshore this and that, I'll just get one of those, right? And then I won't have to pay taxes anymore, and it's just going to be great, and I'll have all this money. But really, it isn't like that anymore. You can't escape anymore and be a hobo and tie your little string on a stick and just go to the Caribbean. You have all this stuff to do. So it's
a great point. It's in the past, and probably the 80s and 90s, where there were some loopholes. Those loopholes have effectively been closed, and the way that the IRS and the court system here in the U.S. are what they consider income and what they consider foreign and domestic, and what your obligations as a U.S. person are so broad that you can't hide it, you can't disappear legally anymore, and try to have no taxes. But there are still ways, and there are still reasons to have international trust, to still meet your goals and still potentially minimize those risks and those obligations to the U.S. government.
So who do you think would be an ideal candidate for this then?
So this goes back to the original, or I guess our first chat here, our first question, where we were dealing with, who do I help with? A lot of times it's going to be older folks. So one of the top considerations is if you already own or will, and you want to ensure that those estate, that those assets overseas get transferred to another generation smoothly. A trust is a great way to do that in a lot of jurisdictions, because it stays in the trust. It's not, you don't have to go through the paperwork of dealing with probate or estates in a foreign country. And actually, I'll mention one personal story in this. So my wife is from Russia, and her family, this is a really funny story she told me, a long while back, but so her grandfather owned property, and it was transferred, or, he passed away, so it was transferred to her father. And the probate process in Russia and in a lot of countries is not easy. It's not cheap. It's costly and time consuming. And her father just said, I'll do it later. I'll figure it out next time. And 15, 20 years later, it doesn't, that next time doesn't come, and he passes away. So it was then transferred, ultimately it's inherited by my wife, but it's still in the name, in the legal paperwork, it's still owned by her grandfather, who's been deceased for quite a while.
Oh, wow.
So I think it was, I guess, inherited by her and her mother, and they finally had to start the process of going through that. And I don't know exactly the probate process in Russia, but it seems like the cost multiplies for each generation you ignore. You don't transfer it. So,
man.
It's gonna be rather time consuming and costly. But that's for instance something that happens all the time. Folks retire to Belize, they retire to Mexico, and they pass away without a Mexican or a Belizean will or any type of estate planning in those countries, and you have to deal with those countries' probate and estate laws. And sometimes it's not easy. It's not cost effective, but you'll have to deal with it. So a trust is a fantastic opportunity to avoid all of that, because the assets stay in the trust and merely the beneficiary changes, or it goes on to a secondary beneficiary from the primary. So lots of ways that makes sense. So a lot of times it's older folks, retirees who already have assets overseas. Occasionally we'll deal with folks who already have substantial wealth, who want to diversify that more and have greater flexibility. And that gets into goals where they feel like, they have a well-established estate plan in the United States. They have good asset protection here, but they want to reach out and grow that array. So they want to have assets overseas, and for flexibility purposes, and also just because maybe the U.S. isn't giving them quite the return that they had anticipated. So they'll start branching out with that. A lot of those are the two primary that I deal with. I'm sure there are, there's probably other categories of folks. I'm trying to think, folks who kind of do it yourself, who do it yourself IRA, the self-directed IRAs and stuff like that. An international trust would be beneficial for them as well.
Okay.
Yeah, we deal with a lot of those people too, who want checkbook control and they want to diversify on that. So yeah, that's good. Okay, guys. Well, we've been talking to Rocky Reidel of the Reidel Law Firm, and he is an expert on offshore trusts. We've been talking about that all day, and now it's about time to wrap up. I want to thank you so much, Rocky, for coming here and being here.
I hope we talked about enough. This is such a broad subject.
It is a broad subject, but we're going to have Rocky back to talk about insurance too. So be sure to get part 2 of this as well, because we're not going to stop. We're just going to kind of end it for right now.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Tammy, take us away.
All right. Thank you again so much, Rocky. It's been really enlightening listening to everything you've had to say. I've been taking notes, so we'll have all of that in our notes section for this episode. Good. And also we'll have some contact information. So if you have questions for Rocky, you can reach out to him. Thank you again, Jennifer and Brian, for hosting today's episode. And if you do have any questions, comments, you'd like to make a shout out or recommend someone for us to interview, interview, please email me at Tammy, Tammy, at leafylegalservices.com. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.
Attention real estate investors and entrepreneurs. Did you know that real estate investors are a primary target for lawsuits? According to the National Survey of the Court data, 25% of Americans risk being sued in their lifetime. However, if you are a real estate investor, you have a 95% chance of being sued in the next 20 years. Leafy Legal Services helps you protect your assets and strategically grow your business and wealth. Leafy Legal Services are experts at the Series LLC and Delaware Statutory Trust, two of the newest and most ideal legal structures for real estate investors. Leafy Legal Services have the most personalized and affordable solutions for setting up LLCs. Property owners are always at risk when it comes to their assets. Anonymity is so important. If you own just a rental house and you own your home, you have to protect yourself and your properties from any potential legal issues. Leafy Legal Services have the right solutions to make sure you are happy and feel secure. They offer cost-effective documentation that suits their clients' needs. For a free consultation and ebook, visit leafylegalservices.com. They are waiting to hear from you. leafylegalservices.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Don't wait. Take action now. LeafyLegalServices.com. Protect your assets, grow your business, and manage your wealth.